our Tainos came from South America.
Mm.
They were originally from South America, and they started traveling to all the islands in the Caribbean, and they ended up here.
So you said originally Tainos came from South America.
South America. Yeah.
Okay, and I did that. I believe I'm sorry. It was maybe 3 years ago that there was a. She is Puerto Rican, and she was doing DNA research,
Mhm.
and they've actually linked the Taino DNA from South America, and I'm glad that you brought that up. So science is finally catching up with history.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And it's the don't give me the name of the river in South America. Is it the Orisoyo? I think. Don't hold me to that. I'll edit it if not. But I think it was the Orisoyo River in South America, to where there are people that are still there, that they're testing the DNA from people here on the island to there, and they're matching up and they're finding these that it's the same people. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. Actually, it started from South America.
Yeah.
Colonial Puerto Rico did not disappear entirely as previously believed. Historians believed the indigenous tribe called the Tainos were completely eradicated after Europeans arrived to the island during the 15th century. But now that's not the case. Researchers have found 3 genomes from ancient skeletons living in the DNA strands of living Puerto Ricans. With me now to explain this important discovery is one of the geneticists on the project, Maria Nieves Colon. Good to see you, Maria.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So I'm fascinated by this story. I'd always been told, I have family from Haiti, I'd always been told that the Tainos were completely eradicated after Europeans arrived to the Caribbean islands. So explain to our audience why these results are so important to you, and of course to not just the people of Puerto Rico, but all the people in the Caribbean who would have had Tainos living on some of those islands.
Yeah, this is a very common story, actually, that we hear throughout the Caribbean. And it stems from interpretations of the writings that European colonizers left behind. They talk about people on these islands being wiped out or dying out pretty quickly after colonization. But that idea kind of bumps up against oral histories and stories that people tell on the islands of having, for instance, an indigenous great-grandmother or carrying cultural traditions that have a native origin into the present. So what our study... Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, what our study looked at was the genomes of the ancient population to try to understand whether or not there was some genetic continuity that went hand in hand with the cultural continuity that we also see.
And you've spent 10 years doing that, working on this research, which is remarkable. So what are some of the biggest discoveries you were able to make over the course of your research?
Yeah, so we found 2 main things with our study. We looked at the genetics of about 124 ancient people that lived in Puerto Rico, at least 1,000 to 600 years before European contact. And we found first that there was a genetic connection between these ancient people and present-day indigenous communities in the Amazon, which suggests that it was Amazonian people who initially kind of peopled the islands of the Caribbean. And we've also found there was a partial genetic continuity between them and present-day Puerto Ricans. And I say partial because we did also find a lot of genetic diversity that was present in the past that isn't present today. So clearly there was a decline. But the fact that we found 3 sequences that persisted into the present day suggests that this wasn't a complete genetic extinction.
That's fascinating. And I had always long wondered where the Taino actually came from. So the idea or the hypothesis that they originated in what is present-day Brazil is also really, really interesting. Did the climate in Puerto Rico and in the Caribbean make it difficult to analyze the DNA?
Yeah, well, that's part of the reason why it took so long. So the same conditions that make the Caribbean a beautiful place for vacation, the warmth and the humidity, make it possibly the worst place for DNA preservation. So ancient DNA in general is always degraded and fragmented because we're working with genetic material that has been in bones or teeth for thousands, sometimes hundreds of years. And when it's really hot, that degradation just becomes faster. So in order to deal with those issues, we had to work in extremely clean conditions. So we would take the skeletal remains and we would analyze them in a clean lab, and then we would wear these spacesuits that sort of protect the samples from our own skin and hair so we don't contaminate the samples. And we also have to use cutting-edge technology for sequencing these genomes. So for determining the A's, T's, and C's, we have to use these very large and expensive machines. And that kind of technology just wasn't available 10 years ago. So that's part of the reason why it took us such a long time to do.
And, you know, so the other thing that I'm sort of intrigued by is modern day humans have been on this planet a relatively short period of time when you compare the age of the planet and you compare the age of some species of animals who have been here for many millions of years. I wonder why there was never a study done of people now living in the Caribbean, in addition to Puerto Rico and some other countries, to discover whether or not the Taino may have mixed with the population of either colonial Europeans or even Africans who were brought to some of these islands, and that DNA you would be able to see that DNA in modern day genetic testing. But has that never been the case?
Yeah, there's been previous research, but most of it has been done with present day populations. So like Puerto Ricans that are living now, like myself or my family, would get sampled and we would look at their genetic diversity. And as you said, we would find that there is a mix between Native American genomes of Native American ancestry and African and European ancestry. But the question that we weren't able to answer through those approaches was how much of that Native American component stems from the island's ancient inhabitants versus coming from Native peoples that came later on, perhaps relocated through the process of colonization or something like that. So we did have previous research in that. It's just that it was different in focus.
Really fascinating. So how does your discovery now alter the way we think about the history of Puerto Rico?
Well, for me personally, I think it gives voice to communities that were marginalized and misrepresented in the historical record. So by integrating the ancient DNA with archaeology and also examining the historical record, we can sort of paint a more complete picture. It's as if we had a puzzle and we were missing some pieces, and this work allows us to have a much clearer image of that puzzle because we can add one more piece to it. And it also tells us that some of these oral histories, some of these cultural traditions that people have must also be considered as sources of evidence when we ask research questions about the past.
And so I guess after spending 10 years doing this fascinating study, what is next for you?
Well, I'm currently collaborating with other people to expand this research to look at other islands in the Caribbean. We would like to obtain higher resolution data and data from many other ancient communities so that we can see if these patterns replicate in Haiti or in Cuba or in other places in the region. And we're also looking at expanding sampling across the Americas so we can have a much better reference point when we're analyzing the ancient genomes of the Caribbean to other populations.
That's really, really fascinating stuff. And where can people find your just completed research?
Yeah, so we posted a preprint of our manuscript on bioRxiv, which is a server on the internet, and we can also, or people can also access our study through Twitter. It's all posted on my Twitter account. So.
What's your Twitter handle?
At MitoPR.
All right. Awesome. Thank you, Maria Nieves Colon. We really appreciate it. And come back and tell us as you update the study what more you've learned. We'd love to hear it.
Thank you for having me.
They were originally from South America, and they started traveling through all the islands in the Caribbean. But they were not, because you know that there were Indians in Central and South America that were hostile. Mm-hmm. But the ones from Puerto Rico and this region, they were kind.